mean, we hadn't even gotten to the speaker. We had a guest speaker up in the office area, and I think I told him, I did tell him, his name, you know him, Elder Sean Tyson of the PFW was my speaker for that night, and he was there waiting to preach. And I had to inform him that he wouldn't be preaching, but Apostle Rogers would take care of him. And so after I did the benediction, I walked back up those stairs, and Apostle Shoa came to me and said, District Elder Stringer, what's going on? I said, well, Apostle Rogers said that there's some issues need to be dealt with. I said, you would need to talk with him. And I took the mic and put it back in the holder, knowing that the system was shut down. And he grabbed the mic, and he's hitting the mic, trying to get sound. And he's saying, Saints, hold on. And this mass exodus is happening. They're leaving the sanctuary. They're leaving out of the sanctuary. And he said, come back, come back. And, of course, no one could really hear him. And it was funny. At some point, somebody turned on the house system, which wasn't sufficient. And Apostle James Silver grabbed the microphone because some of the people went into prayer at the altar. He said, you got 5 minutes to pray and you got to get out of here. Yeah, he said that. You know how Silver is. And, of course, I'm told that sitting outside, I didn't witness this, but I was told this, that sitting outside was Apostle Lawrence Campbell. Somebody said in a white Mercedes. So apparently it sounded like he was waiting to be ushered in at the appropriate time. And he was inquiring, where's everybody going? They were going home. That's how the assembly ended, and that's how we closed out that meeting.
In Chapter 3, entitled Understanding the Legal Challenges of Bible Way Church Worldwide, when did you first discover that the General Assembly Impasse had taken on a legal nature?
After that, the organization was divided. They were having their meeting in 1998, namely, at this point, it would have been the Women's Council, because we have 3 meetings. We have the March meeting, which is the workers' meeting, the July meeting, usually the National Convention, and then what we call the Women's Council. And at that meeting, usually the bishops would get together just to talk about, things while the women were meeting, having their various auxiliary meetings. And 2 of the persons who were not quite settled at that time had attended that meeting, and that was the Honorable late Bishop B.F. Peterson Sr. and his son Jr. had attended. And upon returning from that meeting, what had happened was they had received documents that they had given them, and when they brought those documents back to us, I began to look at them myself and Bishop Brian Collins. We began to inquire because for the first time we saw something called DCRA. We didn't know what that was. We did our research to find out that was the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, which in most states is the office of the Secretary of State where nonprofits or corporations register. And upon my inquiry, I found out that they had taken to that particular department and they had refiled all of our papers and they had changed the nature of our organization. It was then a religious society. They had changed it to a nonprofit corporation, which meant that we had to do biannual filing. Of course, as I began to inquire, because at that time, not only was I the youth president, but I was also the general secretary, which is the guy that carries all the documentation and the seal of the church. And I signed all license. And they told us that this had taken place, and I got copies of the filing that they had done there at the DCRA in Washington. And upon our perusal, we discovered that they had removed Apostle Rogers from being presiding bishop and just made him a part of the board. They had taken the treasurer, which is then the Apostle Curtis Brown, and put him on the board. And they had taken the general secretary, which was Apostle Lally, and put him on the board and put in all of their leaders. And Campbell was now the leader, and then others were put in places as leaders. And I began to make inquiries at the office as to how this was possible. And they said, well, they could do this. I said, well, how could they do that? This was never voted on. And then they began to try to withstand me there is at the DC office, tried to withstand me. And I began to dig into the legal aspects of it. And I discovered that according to the codes of DC, that documents cannot be filed without the seal of the organization. And also that such a move to change the designation of an organization from a religious society to a nonprofit must be met with a certain criteria. That criteria was 30-day notice had to go out to the voting body, and then the voting body would vote on it. So none of that happened, and I raised those issues. And there's a whole lot that goes with that, but we push for revoking of the document, which in the chapter to come, when I explain things fully in the video, I'll tell you how we revoked stuff for the first time in the history of that organization in D.C. We actually made history. A lot of weird things took place in terms of me talking with bankers and locating monies. It's quite interesting. You do want to listen to the video. But to the point of how I knew it was legal, all of these things became legal issues on the face. It was quite obvious to me that if you're changing documentation without consent of the body, that's illegal. If you're taking monies and you're putting in places where the officers who were duly appointed or elected in this case were in charge of the finances and you did not get their permission, something's wrong. I knew then we had not only a political issue on Bible Way, but now we had a seriously legal case developing.
Who filed the first lawsuit?
Well, there were several actions that ensued. We had the action of the money. We had the action of the property and assets, namely the Two Notch Road property and the Silver Lake property in South Carolina. And then we had the trademarks, the name of Bible Way Church in Crystal City, Virginia at the PTO. And so we had several fronts working. Now, as it relates to the funds, because there was a large CD that had gone missing from our account, and we had tried to track it down, and we couldn't track it down, and eventually we did find it, and we initiated a charge. I wouldn't call it a suit, but we initiated a claim against the individual that had taken control of that money. We dismissed it, but simultaneously, if not before, because I had to check my records, and I'll have that in the video, then Apostle Rogers was being sued by the so-called Bible Way Church, which was Lawrence Campbell at that time, according to their representation, and the others against him for the property. Now, keep in mind, because this is an interesting timeline, for a minute, they were actually in charge of the organization because they had successfully changed the documents, at least at the DCRA. We had to prove our case to get it revoked. So for a period of time, under the cover of false documents, they were actually Bible Way Church. They actually were. And there was a newsletter put out by Apostle Campbell called the Apostles' Epistle. I remember it. And in that particular epistle or magazine, he stated that the DCRA determines who is the rightful Bible Way Church. Of course, under the cloak of the fraudulent documents he had filed, he was exactly that. We were not. We had to prove our case, which it took us 2 years to do. We finally did that, and all of that, I have in documentation, and will allow you to have copies and reference that when you view and listen to the video. You'll be able to click on it and download that information, or go to the sites, government offices, the courts, and get the documents, and even PDFs that you can print out. And I'm going to have available the videotape and the transcript that you'll be able to get, that you'll be able to see how the lawsuits unfolded. They were quite interesting. We prevailed in all of them, and we'll explain that at a later time.
In Chapter 4, entitled The Summary, Common History, and the Conclusion, how did Bible Way Church and International Bible Way arrive at a compromise?
Compromise came because of a very humble man and a great leader called Chief Apostle Huey L. Rogers. From the very outset, Apostle Rogers, though we had an absolute slam dunk win on all fronts, said, these are still our brothers, and we should divide property and money with them. He was extremely benevolent. I don't think I've ever seen it before. And me, I had my sword sharp and my guns loaded, but he tempered that a lot of times and said, we need to compromise. And so in the video, you'll hear how each level of conflict was met with his desire to compromise and to be at peace with his brethren. So Apostle Rogers really was the catalyst of compromise between Bible Way and International, because once I explained to you in the videos the entirety of the case, supported by documents and videos, you will see that there was no way we were going to lose. In point of fact, somebody could have actually went to jail had Apostle Rogers not wanted to compromise.
What exactly does the agreement mean when it states both can refer to the common history?
Well, that simply points to the fact that we all started out together. There's a history that can't be denied. These are sons and grandsons of Apostle Williams. We all came in under his ministry. And also because International had to reorganize, because once they were revoked in D.C., that came a couple years later, and they no longer had an identity. In order to not keep operating illegally, they had to register. And they registered, I believe, in Baltimore, I think in the year 2008, I believe. But I have the documents to support that, in order to remove themselves from illegal operation. So with that, they really don't have a 60-year history, because they really started in 2008, no longer being a part of the organization, having been removed from its administration. However, it would have been mean-spirited to not allow them to reference their history. And so we capitulated in order that they too can cite that history. But keep in mind, International is not 60 years old. Bible Way is the continuation of Apostle Williams. International has a breach in its history because the brethren were eventually removed from the organization, and for a minute they prevailed under false pretense as Bible Way. But once they were revoked, and that it was said that their filing was false, according to the documents I have, and that are public documents in D.C., the organization went back to a religious society the way Apostle Williams set it up. Apostle Rogers and others' names were put back at the top of the list as trustees. I was a trustee of record, still am, as a matter of fact. If you go down there today, you'll see my name and his and others. And now these individuals no longer had a designation, so they had to establish an organization, call it the International Bible Way Church. And as a matter of fact, I was actually at the closing meeting. I was one of the principal persons sitting around the table. And we consented that it was okay for them to use that name, because that also could have been an issue. And we consented that they can refer to the common history, but they cannot put the logo on their license. They can't use it for anything other than a reference. We own it. We allow them to refer to it by putting it on their programs, but they can't sell T-shirts, etc., etc. But more is explained in the video.
Looking back over your experience, do you think that Apostle Williams anticipated this kind of outcome?
I don't know if he anticipated to the extent that we went through it, but I will tell you, Apostle Williams was a very, very wise man. In our last meeting with him in Emmons, South Carolina, he spoke to us in his keynote address, and his message was, 2 builders, 2 foundations. I think he knew something was going to happen.
When will your 4-part video be released?
Well, this is the 60th year, and the official 60th year of Bible Way Churches takes place in September. So in September of 2017, I'm going to release this 4-part series. For the record, the year of Impasse, the transitioning of Bible Way Church and the International Bible Way Church. I think for posterity's sake, this record must be left correct, because there are a lot of revisionists. Of course, there are a lot of people that have it wrong. My position is, I was there from the very beginning. I was actually the one who was liaison with the attorneys and the presiding bishop. I was the one that did much, if not all, of the legwork. I was the one that was the prosecutor over the expulsion of the bishops. So I did all the research. I have all the documentations, and I was assisted by several principal people who will be named in the video. And it needs to be correctly laid out that we might know the history, and that the words of Apostle Williams won't fall to the ground. He said there will always be a Bible Way church worldwide.